Hello everyone, this is Mocha Product Manager Martin Brennand, and today we're going to be going through the hidden Mocha settings, and by hidden we mean just not in plain sight. So we're going to be talking a little bit about each individual preference and how they work, because we all know the preferences are there, but a lot of the people don't know how each individual one works. So we're going to dive into that a bit. Like, it sounds like it's going to be dull, but it is actually really important to know these settings so that you can really flesh out your workflow when you've got big projects. We're also going to look at doing the project settings, not just preferences, because project settings are different from preferences in terms of the defaults they have. And we're also going to look at the often overlooked viewer preferences, which can be really helpful when you're visualizing work or doing renders. So today it's mainly going to be Mocha Pro, but we're going to be covering a little bit of the plugin, a little bit of the standalone, and we're going to talk about how Mocha AE interacts with those as well, because obviously the preferences are going to be a bit different for the light versions. So we'll switch over now. Oh, and hello, we've got a few people in. Hi John, hi Michael, hi Valarts and Abdikarim. We're going to be doing a lot of panels today, but it should stream very quickly because it's all going to be little grey boxes. So let's switch over to the screen. There we go. All right. So here we are inside the Mocha Pro plugin. I've also got the standalone open down here because I'm going to switch between both of them a couple of times. So we're inside the Mocha Pro plugin in After Effects. Let's just close that and have a look. So we've got Mocha Pro here, and I've also got Mocha AE here, because we're going to open both of these to have a look. So we'll load up Mocha Pro, and we'll come into the preferences. So preferences by default is set to the specific defaults down here. If you want to start from scratch and play along, you can click down here and restore defaults, and this will just reset everything to factory settings so you can see what's going on here. We're going to go from left to right. And obviously, if you've got any questions, I'm going to keep looking over to my right occasionally to see the chat. Thanks, Michael, for that. And we're going to, if there's any requests you have over preferences, if you've got any clarification you want, just ask them in the chat and we'll try and catch up there. So here we are in output settings. Now, this is one of the big important areas of the preferences that you need to get a handle on, because this is basically storing and using your data. And your data, obviously, when you're doing your work, is some of the most important stuff that you've got. So we'll kick off at the start. We should never turn autosave off. That's just a given. Autosave is your lifesaver if anything goes wrong. I've got mine quite low here. This defaults actually to 5 normally, so 5 minutes, but in the VFX world, you know as well as I do that 5 minutes is a long time, so I recommend actually setting it down to 1 minute so that you've got as many backups as possible. Now, I set a very conservative number of backups at 5, but you understand how this works by going into the Autosave directory. Now, this is a little bit different depending on whether you're working in the plugin or the standalone, and we'll show the difference in a minute. So in the plugin, because you're working from a host environment, there's no defined location when you're in the host because you don't know where the footage is. So we have a set directory here, and you can put these anywhere you like by changing this directory here. So I'm going to open this one up here and choose this, and let's just reveal this directory. Over here, and let's have a look inside. So what we have in here is a huge history of different saves. Now you can see here, because I work in many different software over the week, I've got lots and lots of different autosave backups. And very specifically, if you've switched between two different types of software, say for example After Effects versus Nuke, then you get 2 different sets of autosaves. There's no point of saving over the file you've worked on in Nuke if you've got a project going on in After Effects. So we keep all of these separate over time so that if you need to go back to a project or restore something when something's gone wrong, you've got all of this history available to you. Now, the key thing here is that these are called .autosave, so you do need to open them with all files to find these, because by default we filter down to Mocha files. So at the moment they're just .autosave. So, these two here, these are also the cached ones. So these actually save into temporary files when we're caching the data, and that saves in here. You don't need to worry about these because everything goes into the history here. If we look over at the standalone version, however, it's a little bit different. Thanks, John. I'm keeping my camera off just to keep latency low today because the connection down here is a little bit slow, so we'll just be seeing the screen, not my face today. So, over in the standalone version, you can see we have a path. Always up here in the top of Mocha Pro for standalone, you have the path of where the project is. If we go inside preferences for standalone, you can see a little bit different. What we have here is the output directory as well. And the autosave is made relative to that output directory. So whenever we're doing work inside standalone, it's going to be in the same folder as where your results directory is instead. And this just makes it a lot easier when you're moving files around with standalone because you've got footage, you've got a Mocha project, and then you've also got all your autosave backups in the same place. But the important part is that you can define this inside the standalone version. You can either keep it relative to where the footage is, or you can define an absolute path, which a lot of people like to do because they like to keep their results separate from where their source footage is. And so now you can just define where that is. By default, it's just your documents folder, but obviously you can set it to an external cache if you need to, or a different drive. While we're in here, we'll go down to the next one. So right down the bottom here, we have the cache directory. And this is another very, very important one because it really defines how your work is going to go. It's performance related, it's also size related. So you can see here at the moment in my current image cache, I've got about 300 gigabytes left in my drive, which is actually getting a little bit small when you're working with large footage. So generally you want to define this cache directory in your biggest and fastest drive, and usually not on the same drive as your applications or systems, because you want to make sure that you're getting as much throughput as possible to that image cache. Now again, I've got mine set to default, which is just in the library cache on this Mac. So when you're setting this up, I would recommend putting this on either an SSD drive or a very, very fast FireWire external drive. I definitely would not put it on a network because that will slow things down quite a bit. And yes, Nick, that's exactly what we were going to talk about right now. So this is one of the big areas where speed is going to improve if you set this cache directory to the fastest drive you've got, because this is setting up the cache that Mocha reads from, and it also sets up render in memory. If it runs out of memory, it'll render these to this cache here as well. So it's very, very important that this cache here is set to something very big and fast. Another thing to realize too is your disk space is extremely important. If you've only got, say, 50 gigs left on your drive, you are going to start running into speed problems because Mocha having to swap out space to actually catch up. So the more disk space you can have free to let the cache do its thing, that will help a lot. And the same goes over for the plugin. If we look at the plugin version, let's just cancel out of this autosave directory. This is in exactly the same location, but you can see it's going to its own Mocha plugin directory, not a Mocha standalone directory. And we keep these separate again. I mean, even though the cache files are unique files, they're all set with a unique identifier, we don't want them mingling in the same spot as the other files, because when we go up and clear the cache, and we'll come over here and see, we've got this option here called clear cache. We want to make sure that we're not clearing, when we clear the global cache, that we're not clearing cache files we intended to keep in the other version of the software. And as we know, in the most current version of Mocha standalone licenses, you get the plugins with that license. So if you are swapping between the standalone and the plugin, you don't want to be able to clear this cache in the same location. So we'll go over back to preferences. So that's the output settings. Very, very important. The good thing about these autosaves too is that you can use them as like a temporary go back to kind of area too. So you can set this to a directory that you want to keep and then back up for looking back at later. So it's good to just know where that directory is on your system. On the Mac, it'll be different, but on the Windows and Linux, it'll be different, but you can always find out where it is by going to the preferences. All right, let's pop over to the System tab. And this is another big important one. There's a lot of features here, and a lot of people don't play with them, and I recommend tweaking it to what you need the most. Undo history size, 100's a good size. Like, if you have to go back 100 spaces in your undos, there's definitely something wrong, but 100 is a good, decent default. So I would keep that about that, and then you'll be fine, because undo actually undoes tracking as well. So if you've tracked 100 frames and you weren't happy with something, you can actually press undo 100 times to go backwards if you want to. But often it's probably just easier to redo the track. Under memory usage, in Standalone, we use a fair whack. So 80% of the system memory. Now that's obviously swappable, so we are going to be sharing with what we've got available. We're not going to just hog it. But it does help to actually set this to a realistic value when you're working. If you've always got other applications open that are going to be hogging a lot of memory, you can set this to a realistic value to manage expectations. And in the plugin, we recommend setting this to about 50, so it's got an equal share with the host application you're working in, say Nuke or After Effects. The reason we say that is because in recent versions of Mocha, it is actually a separate process. It's not a plugin process inside the host anymore. It's actually running separately as an application which is being driven by the plugin. So you are sharing the same system memory, not just the memory that the host has. So it's really important that you sort of manage exactly how much memory is going in there. And 50% is a good place to start, especially if you're dealing with big, heavy files like 4K, 8K, and things like that. Down here in maximum thread pools, you don't really need to worry about this one unless support tells you to change it. This actually only really matters on really big multi-core CPUs on the Mac, where it gets a little bit overexcited and tries to use too many threads at the same time. So we can crunch those threads to stop it from getting a bit excited. So don't worry about that one. You never have to turn this one on unless you're asked to by support because there's an issue. This one down here, however, is a really interesting one because we worked with Adobe to get this in. So this little track in Mocha AE option lets you define your version of Mocha Pro as the track in Mocha AE option. So whenever you set that button inside After Effects, it will instead launch or apply Mocha Pro instead. And this actually works with the Standalone as well. So if I go ahead and let's just cancel this for a second, and we'll close up this one, and we'll go back to After Effects. Let's just a second. I'm going to go back over to Mocha Standalone, and in my System tab, I'm going to say use this version with AE. And if I click OK, and I come back to After Effects, and let's just restart After Effects. And we'll load it up again, because we have to reload those preferences. There we go, we're back inside. And we'll load up that one. Okay, so now, over in the animation menu, there's always been an option called, let's just select out loud, Track in Boris FX Mocha. And we very specifically took out the Mocha AE part because of this thing that we can do now. So if I select this now and apply it, instead of applying the Mocha AE plugin, it's actually loading the Mocha Pro standalone version. And the same works with the Mocha plugin. It will apply the Mocha plugin in the timeline instead. So here, now it's setting up my project file, it's setting the location, and so on. So we can start setting up specifics inside Mocha Standalone. So I'm going to turn that off, because I like having my plugin in there. So let's just go and turn that off again. And we'll close that. And the good thing too is it opens separate instances when you do this. So you can actually have separate instances open of the Mocha Pro Standalone if you need to. So let's go back over to preferences. There's a lot of preferences to cover here. So I'm going to turn that one off as well. Okay, over here in UI look and feel. Most of the time it defaults to rotational controls. Now, rotational controls are popular for people especially using trackballs or the specific editing balls, because it lets you hover over a thing and rotate to get the value you need. Now, in a lot of other software, most people are comfortable with linear controls, and linear controls basically are the way you drag left and right instead. And I personally prefer linear controls as well. The only advantage to rotational controls is if you do it very small rotations, you get bigger changes. If you do huge rotations, you get a much more fine-tuned thing. So sometimes it is good for that, but most of the time linear controls is fine. Now, this down here is our mouse wheel controls. This was probably the most requested feature inside 9.5, which was adding the mouse wheel to zoom the viewer. We took a long time to get that one in, sorry about that. But we have all the controls here to enable it. So you can obviously turn that off if you don't like that, but who would do that? Or you can just define it that the mouse only scrubs a timeline and doesn't zoom in, because some people do prefer that, especially in editing. And then we have tablet pressure down here. Tablet pressure is only valid for your area brush tool. So that just helps get strokes when you've got the Wacom tablet or other tablet pressure, to make sure that you get defined strokes when you're using the area brush. But so the mouse wheel zooms viewer one specifically doesn't actually turn off timeline scrolling. And we've set it up specifically so that, let's just click OK here. If you're in this view, you can scroll back and forth using the scroll wheel, and that will zoom in and out. But if you're still over the timeline, it will actually still scroll the timeline. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility with both. If you have the other radio option on, it will just always scroll if you're over the viewer. But here, it just depends on the context of where you're scrolling from. So here in the viewer, we can just scroll back and forth, but here in the timeline, we can scroll the timeline, which can be very useful. Right, let's go and check the next layer. Now again, layer settings. Not many people change the layer settings, and there are some reasons to actually define these as a default. So if you're working on specific shots that have a lot of different color changes that don't match what you want here, it is very, very handy to change these for project-specific things. So if you've got a lot of red in your scene, maybe you don't want a red spline and you want to change it. So you can define all of these things here to get the defaults. Like the default matte is always white. Maybe it's not good for your particular project to actually run that matte as white. So change it if it makes sense to over here. Same with the default opacity. So we set default opacity for the matte as 0.5. So let's come and have a look at this. I'll draw a nice big shape and turn on my matte. And for some people that's enough. Like you get a good contrast between being able to see the matte and being able to see what's going on behind it. But if you're doing some heavy roto and you actually are defining the matte itself as the thing that you need the most, you may want to actually set it to 1 so that you can actually get full opacity on this so that you can actually see what's going on. The other thing is you might want it even less, so you could set this down to like a 0.1. Now that's very, very subtle, but if you're working on refined work, it can really, really help. And there's a couple of other little hidden settings under here that we can talk about while we're in this mode. So I'm going to ramp that up a little bit more. Let's go maybe 0.3, and we'll change our matte color. So when you're working in this matte view here, there's another hidden setting underneath the drop downs, which is very, very useful when you're working in roto. I'm going to do a little bit more of a complicated edge here. Let's just try and get the edge of this t-shirt, for example. All right, like so. Now, the hardest thing when doing roto for any user is the fact that the spline itself gets in the way when you're doing roto. Now, one way you can do that, obviously, is to turn off the overlays, but then you don't have any of the controls. So the best thing you can do here, let's just ramp up that opacity a little bit more, and we'll change the color. There we go. Is you can go over to this setting over here. So you've got this thing called show spline tangent. So if I actually turn this on here, we've got a drop down here. And you've got tangents, which is just the little pulls that come out of the side here. But you've also got this option for splines. And this is one of my favorite things to use when I'm actually doing any roto, is turning off the splines. So if I turn off the splines here and just turn on the tangents, we can even get rid of the tangents. Let's get rid of the just show selected tangents. Now what you've got here is just the matte edge. So you can actually see exactly where your matte edge is going to be. So it makes it a lot easier to define and make sure that your edge is perfect without that spline getting in the way. It's a really, really nice way of just seeing the control points to control exactly where it is. So if I go ahead and, for example, grab these and do a little edge width here, so let's just set a little bit of offset. Now we're just seeing the fall off. And this is just hidden away under the tangent section. It's a really, really useful setting when you're doing this kind of work because you no longer have all that stuff in the way. So that really makes it hard to see what's going on. And obviously you can press the tilde key to hide it back and forth, but it's just so much nicer to be able to just turn the splines off completely and just keep working. So it's a really, really cool little hidden away feature, this one here. All right, let's go back into preferences. So we've covered that, Now, let's talk about default spline weight. So again, if you're doing a lot of organic stuff, it's really, really helpful to change your default length or your default weights for your X-spline and Bezier spline. So these are a kind of half curve here. So if we cancel here for a second and we just show this, let's actually load up a Bezier for once because we don't show Bezier nearly enough. So if I just draw, I've still got my splines off. Let's put those back on so we can see. So if I just draw this out like this, that's your kind of default handle length. It's, it's reasonable. You can use it to quickly get around stuff. But like if you're doing a lot of bigger shapes or big curves and things like that, you might want a bigger handle on these Beziers. So under preferences, if we set this to say, let's not go crazy. Let's go maybe up to 0.7. And now I draw my Bezier. Now we're getting much bigger handles on this. Now, look, obviously we can control this in different ways, but it does help to be able to define this. And you might need much more refined control on this, and you can go the other way, so like down to 0.1. So I prefer bringing this down to about 0.1 because I like smaller handles. Let's just bring that to 0.1. And if we look at the Bezier now, I'm still drawing the same one. Let's just trash that one. So yeah, that's much nicer. Now I've got control, it's a sharper point, and then I can go in and define my curves a lot easier. So very, very useful to have that little preference there. So let's just keep it back to the default though. That was 0.2. We had people use the work on this to make sure there was what people were most comfortable with, but it's just good to know that they're there. Like again, the default X-spline default spline weight, if you're doing a lot of corner-based X-splines, you might want to set this value to 0 so that you're always starting at pointy X-splines, or vice versa. You might be doing just super smooth ones and you want a full sort of B-spline environment with your X-splines, and you could set this up to a much higher value. So just again, very useful to know that these are here. Some people do get confused by the weight part because some people thought that was thickness, but it is actually to do with how curvy it's going to be. So again, just useful to know what that's doing. Now, the biggest one that gets the most confusion, GPU. GPU is where we get the most support questions about, because there's a lot of settings in here that are a little bit obscure, and we're actually considering hiding half of them because they don't actually need to be changed by users. So let's go down the list. Use vertical sync. We are going to hide this feature because you should never turn this off. Vertical sync is just very important to keep frame sync. Just leave it on. It's very much a legacy one for older footage and older monitors, so we're going to just hide that one eventually. Same with amount of texture RAM to reserve. Now, texture RAM to reserve is an interesting one, and everyone should know about this because it's really, really important to understand what amount of texture RAM is doing. It is not to do with processing. Specifically, it's not to do with tracking, and it's not to do with rendering. The only thing amount of texture RAM to reserve is doing is what is going to be displayed in the viewer. And specifically, you want to have enough texture RAM reserved so that this image can be displayed, but also, say, a zoom window can be displayed, because a zoom window is a copy of that window. And occasionally you want, maybe even in adjust track, for example, there'll be 3 windows because we have add new points or set points. And then over time, let's just set that reference frame. Now we have an additional window. This is all texture RAM is doing. It's defining how much texture RAM on the GPU to reserve when displaying footage. So really, you only need a very small amount inside this preference. Now, some people, who have massive cards want to, set this up to like 6 gigabytes. But really, it only ever needs to be between about 256 and probably at most 1024. 1024 I'd recommend, if you're up in the sort of 8K, 12K kind of area. But 256 is more than enough for most people working on film. Any HD or Ultra HD, you'll probably be fine with 256 to 512. You never need more than that. In fact, you're actually doing yourself a disservice if you do add more in there, because that's texture RAM that's not being able to be used for processing. So really, really important that you keep this value as small as possible. Stereo really only helps if you've got a stereo monitor. So if you've got a stereo monitor and you're working in stereo, great for you. But keep that off, otherwise there's no point in having it on. Now, again, disabled off-screen buffers, that's a very important one. Disabled off-screen buffers is how we render mattes. So we kind of render mattes off-screen in the GPU and then present them on screen. It's kind of a way to just make things smoother and faster. Some systems don't like it, especially if you're working across headless systems. If there's no GPU available to work on the headless system, sometimes you do have to disable this off-screen buffer. It's rare these days, but if support, again, tells you to disable off-screen buffers, you can turn it off here. It's just the problem with this is that when you're working in disabled off-screen buffers, they are slower and they don't look as good. You don't get as nice a gradient on the edges if you're rendering pure CPU mattes. So something we'll clean up in the future, but very, very rare that you're ever going to need this. Now, this one is a very important one, because when you're doing anything in this software, except for a couple of features, you're using GPU processing. You want to be able to select this to be your display GPU. By default, we set it to automatic just to help out. But if you've got more than one GPU, or you have a CPU with GPU capabilities, like an OpenCL device like an Intel 630 or something like that, there will be more than one option in here, and sometimes the system will try and help by giving you an option in automatic that's not the best. So we always recommend, actually, once you've set up your system, going into GPU and defining specifically the display GPU. On Windows, for example, you'll often have an NVIDIA card or an AMD card, and also another option. On the Mac Pros, obviously you'll get the M1 Max, which is both CPU and GPU, but very important that you define the display GPU. And the reason that we have display here is because if you've got 2 GPUs, one is often a secondary GPU for, say, a secondary monitor or separate processing, and that's often not a good one to use, because that's often used for other tasks on the system, especially if you're working in something like Resolve or Fusion, where they want to take over those resources, so Mocha doesn't have those available. So best to choose display where possible, or just your main GPU card if display is not set here. But really, really important. Now, if you run into problems with tracking, rendering, or get some really bizarre crashes, most of the time we're going to recommend you turn off GPU processing. And the reason for this is that most of the time a tracking or rendering problem specifically related to crashes or really bizarre habits, so like you get really weird artifacts or really weird tracking, it's going to probably be a driver issue. So often, you get mid sort of beta NVIDIA drivers or AMD drivers that, are put out there because people want to be on the bleeding edge. And sometimes if they're not a production branch driver, they can cause problems. So we do recommend, obviously, that we are always up to date with the most recent drivers if you can be. I know some people can't be because you're production locked. But it's very important that they're usually the most stable drivers possible. So use GPU if necessary, but sometimes we're going to ask you to turn it off if you're running into a conflict. And we do our best to not blacklist too many GPUs that have problems. There's only, I think, a couple of the Intel ones at the moment that are really not having a good time with our system. So you can still turn them on by saying allow unsupported GPUs, but for the most part, we're actually doing pretty well with them at the moment. Any modern GPU is doing pretty well on our system. But if you can't see your GPU in the list, you can try turning this one on to see what's going on. And as it says down the bottom here, any changes you make in this page, you need to reboot your entire thing. All right, let's go over to software update. This one's an easy one. Self-explanatory. It checks the update. So you can check manually, but we do check every time you boot if this is on. Just to give you an update. So anytime software updated, when you load the program, we go and check to see if there's an update. And then next time you boot Mocha, it will say, hey, there is a patch. Nice and easy. Now, color. Color is a fun one. So everyone now, if you're sort of on version 9 or above, will have this OCIO config stuff. It's also in the Mocha AE version. So if we look at this one, let's add Mocha AE down here. So Mocha AE is about half a version behind Mocha Pro at the moment. So you can see here we're on version 9.0.4. And you'll see the same color options here. So you can see a much more limited preferences inside Mocha AE, but we have the same things in here. So let's go back over to Mocha Standalone, just so we're not getting confused. At the top, if you've got your own config, that's where you load it. So we use a default one. It's very similar to the Foundry Nukes base config. It's the standard one that's used almost everywhere. And you set up your color workspaces here. If you've got a standard that you need to work with for every project, it's really recommended to set up the defaults in here first. So if you're always working in a linearized workspace, just set up your reference linear right here or your scene linear. And that's true for a lot of people. If you've got a specific display type, so you've got a different monitor, set up your different display types here. And then you've got clipped color space mode. You only need to change this if you're working on a very, very old project in Mocha. But most of the time I recommend keeping it on OCIO. The other thing to note in the default color space is how these individual clips are defined. Because depending on the clip, so for example, you can see here we've got a difference between an 8-bit clip, which is sRGB, and you've got a float clip down here, which is scene linear. This is mainly related to the fact that a lot of float clips are straight TIFF or EXR files, and they work natively in scene linear, whereas most 8-bit workflow, at least for our workflows, is under sRGB. So if that's different for you, it's good to define them here. Another thing to note too is that if you're working inside Photoshop to do your clean plates, often if you're working in a float space, it's going to come out as scene linear. So if you want to define it to match, you would need to change it here as well to match the float clip here. We try and write them out as sRGB to make it easier for Photoshop to work with, but you can work in scene linear. You just need to change the color workspace, the proof workspace in Photoshop so it looks right. You've got lots of color space options in Photoshop under that proof menu, and that will help you set it up so it looks the same as what it has in Mocha. So, and again, once again, if you're working in any kind of bit depth conversion, so you've actually forced things through from 8-bit to float, you can define it here. You can set it either from float or back down to 8-bit. So this is specifically the default. So generally what we do is when we're working on a long project, so you've got, several hundred shots to work on, it's good to just set this up for that specific project, or even just define a project specific config so everyone's on the same page. Another thing you can do is something called the OCIO environment variable. So if you're working environment variables in a studio, you can actually just define OCIO, which is the environment variable, and then set the path to your environment variable there, and then anytime you load Mocha, it will just define that config for you. So you don't need to define it inside the program. You can use the environment variable for this. Very, very important if you're working in color workflows, which many places are now. All right, clip. So again, in Standalone, this side is very important. In plugin, not so much, because the plugin is getting the information from the host. But here, again, if you're working on a long project and it's always going to be in 30 frames per second, just change it here. You can either get from one of the picks here. You can see we added 48 a long time ago for when the Hobbit was on. But in over here, we've got, you can just edit it there directly without having to change anything. Same with pixel aspect ratio. Most people are working in square, but if you're working in an anamorphic workflow all the time, it's good just to define it here. And most of these other ones are straightforwards. Sheb asks, is color management rendered on top of frame cache or under? It's rendered to the frame cache purely because when we're working, we are rendering out specific plates. So if you're rendering a remove, or you're rendering a insert, or you're rendering to a clean plate to paint in Photoshop, that has to be color managed immediately in the cache because we're exporting out. And I'll show you what those clips come out to in the clip tab here. So Sheb, for your benefit, over here in the format section, we have these formats here. So specifically, you've got integer result format, so that's 8-bit essentially, and you've got the choice between TIFF and DPX. We have got a very odd bug at the moment in this version where it just gives you the option multiple times, but it's just TIFF and DPX. And the same for this one here. So float is often mostly standardized as EXR, and so that is color managed obviously to scene linear by default. And then we've got TIFF as well, and we've got that weird bug in this particular option as well. But I tend to keep it on EXR. EXR opens fine in Photoshop these days, so if you need to define an EXR inside Photoshop, it's fine. Okay, yeah, for playback inside, I'll show you that in a minute, Sheb. So Sheb asked if for playback inside Mocha. Yes, it is color managed because we have working space and display space, and I'll show that in a minute in the view controls so you can see how that works. So where was I? Oh yeah, over here. So down over here so we're currently inside Mocha Standalone. You can output matte clips as well, and this can be very, very handy in Standalone if you don't want to have to render out your matte clip separately. So if you check this option on, any roto that you've done over time will actually render to disk to your output directory over here. And this means you've got a cache of matte clips already ready to go to import somewhere else. So you don't have to keep on going to the export options over here to export out rendered shapes. You can actually just render them straight to disk automatically through this clip option here, output matte clips. You can't do that inside the plugin version, however. The reason for that is, this is in Mocha AE, let's go to Mocha Pro. Let's in the plugin version, here we go, clip. So you can't do that in here because those clips are rendered to memory. So we don't have that option here for the plugin version. We'll just switch back over to the Standalone for the time being. So formats are the same in plugin and the float version. We also have multi-view EXR output. So this is mainly for stereo again. So whether or not we render multi-views to parts or via channels if you're working in stereo. So that's just for stereo people. You can keep this at the same if you need to. And then we've got the interlacing options. If you're working with interlaced footage, and I really hope you're not, because interlace is such a nightmare. That's my personal opinion. But interlacing, if you're always working with interlaced footage, you can set it up here in Standalone. That's defined by default inside the plugin. So if we look at the plugin again, you can see here we've got those options in the plugin, but we also bring them in by default and interpret them by default inside the plugin. So often you don't need to set this unless you need to work out pull down as well. All right. And then finally, mask on this page. Mask is really, really important if you're working on a project that has a lot of letterboxing. So masking works by, and it's different to roto masking. We're specifically talking about clip masking here. So let's just imagine in this particular shot, we've got letterboxing. We don't, but I'm going to just set up some letterboxing. Over in the clip tab here, we have the crop mask. So generally a crop mask is about 63. So we'll just set those in. So you can see here now, it's cropped it in. And this is really useful for getting rid of that letterboxing when you're tracking. You can also do this manually here. But if you've got a permanent letterbox on all your footage for your project, you can set up a crop mask and then it will trim that letterbox out so it doesn't interfere with tracking and rendering. So it ignores the black edge, which could throw out a track, and instead it just crops it down so it's easier to work with. That means you don't have to set up additional, boxes at the top to block those out. You can just immediately crop it out without having to ignore it. So if you're doing that constantly because you've got a project with which is nothing but letterboxing, you can just set up the default up here in the top and the bottom. Generally, you don't have a left and right crop, but sometimes you do when there's some shade cropping. But yeah, you've got those options there. All right, lens. Lens is self-explanatory. Lens is literally one thing. It's the camera model. If you're doing a lot of distortion over time and all of your lens modeling is either 1 parameter or 2 parameter, you can define it here. If you're working with a lot of VR, it will be equirectangular. If you're using a lot of distortion maps, you can set it here. But generally, that's all that's for. It's just a time saver right here. This is another important one, logging. Now, boring as all hell, but logging is extremely important for you and for support. We recommend that you turn on as many settings in here as possible so that if you do run into problems, you can easily troubleshoot with the support team. I recommend always leaving diagnostic logging on. That is just standard. So that writes to the log here. Let's have a look at what that looks like. We'll view that log. There it is. So this is the stuff that gets logged when you start up a program for the first time. It's telling me the plugin's been loaded in After Effects. It tells us the license and what's going on. It tells you the GPU that's being currently used and the drivers. And importantly, what's been set inside that GPU setting, because we get a lot of support request stuff for GPU. And then talks about things like color configs and all that kind of stuff. It's just a really good log of everything that's happened so far in the software so that if you run into a problem or an error turns up, it'll get logged here. Let's go back into the preferences. So verbose mode is just a much more dense version of that. And again, we encourage, if you're talking to support or you need to send something in, we recommend running Mocha one more time and doing the thing with verbose mode on, because verbose mode just gives you a lot more information, like just little bits and pieces, bits of processing. For example, it'll tell you when it started tracking and when it stopped tracking and things like that. It's just really, really helpful to troubleshoot problems if you have verbose mode on. By default, it's off because it does become very heavy, so you can always turn it off after you've dealt with it. Usage data collection is more for us, so this is sort of anonymous data that's sent to us about how the program's being used, where it's clicked, what sort of things are being used. We don't log anything like file paths or things that would identify what you're working on. It's purely just how is the software being used so we can improve it. Also very important down here is crash and error reporting. We recommend, again, not turning this one off because this one is really, really important for fixing problems when you're having them. Now, again, if you're concerned about data, you can obviously turn it off, but when you're actually working with support, we recommend turning it back on and then running the problem again so that we can get the crash data. It's much more efficient than us getting you to hunt for the crash log, look for it, and things like that. We solve a lot of problems these days with this error reporting, so it's really important that you keep it on if you can. And then finally, over on this side for preferences, we've got key shortcuts. Now, I'm not going to dive into key shortcuts because Elizabeth Postel just actually did a tutorial on keyboard shortcuts and how to work with them. But just know that you've got your defaults, which is the default Mocha. If you don't like the defaults, you've got ones that are kind of matched to your host in preference. So After Effects, for example, will switch out space for pan instead of X, because a lot of people don't like that. But then you can go ahead and define those. So if I'm in default and I'm trying to fix pan because I don't like pan being on X, I can just type in pan, find it, there's my X, and then we can change that. And it'll tell me up here that there's a conflict, so you can actually clear that if you need to or change it. But there's a lot of density in here, and we've got tutorials for this, so I'm not going to dive into this one, but there's a lot of options in here to set up your keyboard shortcuts. Now, we're at the 15-minute mark to the end of this particular office hour, so I'm going to dive in quickly to project settings and then the viewer preferences. So let's come up to the project settings. Now, project settings is a snapshot of what your project is doing, and a lot of this is driven by your defaults in preferences. So here is your opportunity to change them to be project specific. So you've got your length of frames. This can actually be cropped down. So if you know that you're not going to be using more than 300 frames, for example, you could type in 300 here and it'll clip it. You can't get those frames back though unless you change the frame length here. I recommend actually just changing your project length here using the project in out point and then trimming that way. Because then if you zoom out, you've still got your frames here. If you trim it in the project settings, it actually physically trims the project. So it's better if you trim using the in-out range in the project. First frame offset is also very important, especially if you're working in Standalone, but most people are working with a specific offset, like 0 or 1. Some people, especially in studios, are working in the 1001 offset, for example. So you can define that frame offset here if you need to. And again, frame rate. So frame rate is important for exporting data. If you're exporting tracking data or shape data, you want to make sure that your frame rate is correct. In the plugin, if we again look at the plugin, that will be defined by default. So if we look at the project settings for this one, it's fed immediately from the host to define what this is. So you generally don't need to change these settings. So, and then we've got all of our color management. So we can see here, so Asheb, this answers your question that you were asking before about playback. We've got the working color space. So at the moment I'm in sRGB, and then you've got your display view. So display view works out which specific view you're going to be working with, Rec 709, rectilinear, none, etc., etc. So all of these are defined here for your display view. And depending on which specific one you're using, say ACES or things like that, these values will obviously change. So if I worked my working color space to scene linear, for example, my view is still going to be the same because the display view is set correctly. Let's go back to project settings. So again, this is just an offset of those defaults. So if you have to define specifics and you don't want to change your defaults because you're doing a one-off, you can change them here in project settings. The only other two that we need to mention here is views. If you're doing a stereo project, you can define the names of your stereo views here. This is just more to make it pretty so that you can see what's going on. And then resampling is an interesting one. Resampling is purely for insert. So insert RGB, it lets you just define how the inserts are going to be rendered. Previously, we only had bilinear, and sometimes that wasn't useful for specific insert types. So you could get some banding and things like that when fast motion blur was happening and things like that. So now you have the option of nearest neighbor and all the lengths, it's always a fun one to say, in different levels of iterations for the resampling. So it's good to play around with those and find the ones that work best for your insert rendering. Now, that's project settings. Project settings is nice and easy because it is just a snapshot of what you've already done in defaults, but you can change them there. Now, this little guy over here that a lot of people miss is the viewer preferences. These are really, really important for setting up specific views when you're working. So I'm going to draw a shape here. Let's just copy it down here. And then we'll turn on our surface and grid. So I'm going to track this one a little bit too. So all of these set up specific things going on in the viewer. So we've got the grid here. So if I set these grid dividers up, you can see we can get as many grid dividers as we like. So if you're doing very defined work, it does max out at 100, but you probably don't need any more than that. But if you need to make sure that your track is rock solid, you can define grids at a much smaller scale in 2 directions. And 2 directions is quite important because if you have stretched out your perspective, you may only want a grid divider in, say, 50 as opposed to 100 in the other direction. So it's good to be able to define very specific grid levels in here. It's also very handy to actually do the 1 by 1 because you can actually just get a crosshair in the middle of your shot to work out framing. So 1 by 1 just gives you a literal cross with the outside edge, and that's really, really handy for just pinpointing problem areas as well and framing your shots easier. So that's for the grid dividers. Another thing we've got here is trace keyframes. By default, this is set to 5. And trace keyframes is useful for following what your surface is doing. So I've got about, how many have I got here? Let's just keep tracking this a little bit longer. So let's get to about, 30 frames, that'll do. And up here we have the trace button. So the trace button just shows you how many keyframes the curve is following along. And it just helps you see the flow of the track. If I set this to say 50, like I had before, you can now see the whole motion of that track over time. So it's just a very useful way to see how the track is moving over time and if there's any massive erratic problems in your track. It doesn't have any sort of functional adjustment in here, but it does mean that you can easily visualize. Now, this is a fun one too, a skip on playback. Skip on playback, it literally just skips frames depending on where you're working. And this can be really, really useful if you're working with things like stop motion or animation, because you can say, for example, maybe I'm working on 12s, I'm going to skip on 12s, and now every time I skip forward, it's going to jump to 12s. So you can quickly go ahead and define very quickly different roto points on animation and things like that. You can also just use it to playback faster. So if you want to quickly get through the shot and just preview it, you can just skip over 12 frames instead of every 1 frame. So very, very handy, the skip and playback. I should point out, though, that this is not defined by track skip. So you don't skip frames when you're tracking in this particular software yet. We're looking at that in future for a feature to be able to track on 2s or track on 5s for making stop motion tracking a lot easier. But by default, this is just set to 1. Now, this is also off by default, re-render on parameter change. Now, re-render on a parameter change is very, very useful for adjusting things. So I'm going to come in here and just, let's just leave it as is. And let's just insert our Mocha logo. So what re-render on parameter change does, if I'm in the insert module or other modules, let's just turn off our grid warp for a second, I can go ahead and adjust this, and any parameter I change in the insert module, let's turn off mats here, and I'll turn this on. So if I adjust this surface now, it's actually going to render directly to the clip. You can see it's already rendered a clip up here. So this is very useful when you're working to do subtle adjustments and have Mocha automatically render for you. So if I change to, say, let's go to overlay and then I turn on motion blur, again, it automatically renders rather than me having to go up and click the render button every single time. This is not going to be useful in some cases. If you're doing things like megaplate adjustment, for example, we don't actually enable it for megaplates, because if you did a single parameter change and it re-rendered the megaplate every time, that would be hell. It would just be very, very slow to get anything done. But if we just do mini adjustments here for things like insert, it's much, much easier to play around and see how your final result is going to look by adjusting these settings. So just a useful thing to know, it's up there. Like if you're just doing little tweaks over time, you can turn that value on to see what's going on. And then color management. Color management, again, is up in this viewer preferences, and this is just to make it quick for you to access. Like this mirrors actually, if I press Command P for my project settings, these settings actually mirror these settings here. They're exactly the same. If you change one, the other one will change. It's just easier, easier to pop up here and change your color settings right here. Grab your new color config, change it to the specific setting that you need, and then you're ready to go with that one. But yes, so a lot of people don't actually see this one up here. It's an extremely useful one to have up if you're just doing some quick adjustments, especially when you're doing your initial tracking and roto workflow, to be able to just define these to make it a bit easier to see. The grid dividers especially, if you're tracking on this shot, for example, and your grid isn't quite lining up with where you would like it to check how smooth it is, you can just keep on adding more grids until it sits about exactly on like this brick line here, for example. And then it's much easier to see if you're getting any slipping or if you need to adjust in any way. So those are all the preferences hidden away under all these panels. I'm going to switch back to my face for a second to do my outro. Hang on a sec. There we go. So I hope that was useful for everyone. If you've got any questions, do ask them in the comments later. But thank you for your input today, especially you, Sheb and Michael. It was very nice to see some people in the comments today. And we hope it was informative. But thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you next time.